Good morning, everyone. We are here today to discuss something which indeed is a little bit of a follow-up, or partial follow-up of a discussion we started in Dubai. And this time we will discuss about going to beyond the GDP indicator as one of the major indicators on growth and economic growth. In this event, we have two persons that are very well known in their areas, and here I can introduce them briefly before we start. Alexandra Alfieri is currently the Assistant Director in the Statistics Department of the International Monetary Fund, where she leads the program on environment and climate change statistics, which is a very good news for the IMF, I think. And she was prior for 30 years in the UN nations holding different positions. For example, she was the lead of the program on environmental economic accounts of the United Nations, which is going to be a subject we are going to introduce today also as a fundamental one. And then our second panelist is Kanta Kumari Rigo. She's a lead environmental specialist at the World Bank for more than 25 years. And at the moment, she's working in Africa, which is a very difficult region, as a regional climate change coordinator. And in this role, she is leading the development of the next generation of Africa Climate Business Plan. So I think we have here the elements to discuss maybe in a shallow manner, but to introduce the points that are critical at the moment. I will introduce myself, which I didn't do it before. I am Maria Jose Sanz. I'm the scientific director of the Basque Center for Climate Change. And at the moment, I'm also part of the Task Force on Inventories of the IPCC, of the Task Force Bureau. And we have been working in my institute a lot on interoperability of knowledge and data, and working with both institutions on different aspects. So just to start, I will have a brief introduction of, let's say, the issue, but not actually the contents of the discussion. But I mean, we know that we are in a very critical period where we are going through a transition that is led by the decarbonization of economy. But this has to be done in a socially inclusive, and also promoting a more resilient society, because the climate change is providing already us a very bad news in terms of impacts and losses. In this path, the major indicator that is being used in the past decades is the gross domestic product, the GDP. And that's a standard measure of the country's economics performance, but unfortunately doesn't capture some of the aspects that are fundamental for these transitions we are facing, that are the social and well-being aspects. I mean, what is the well-being we want out of this transition needs to be also somehow tracked and measured. So the idea is that we need to explore a portfolio of capitals that make a more comprehensive wealth, like financial capital, produce capital, but also natural capital, human capital, and social capital. And this can be or can give policymakers more insights on how to shape their policies and how to build the wealth in their countries. And I will put an example. For example, in my country, when we have been developing the National Energy Plan, one of the issues that we have been focusing a lot is when the measures on the plan are being deployed, a reanalysis is being done in order to understand if this policy concretely will lead to distributional impacts in low-income households. And I think this is the type of things that governments are looking for now, and the GDP alone doesn't really help on that. So in this context, where we need a willingness to reframe economy, for example, the Club of Rome has been also, and from the scientific perspective, we still have quite a bunch of different ways of looking at, from the well-being economics, the degrowth, the green growth, beyond GDP starting conversation, the donuts economy, the ecological economies, and so on. So we still have quite a diverse landscape in terms of how the academia and the science is looking at. But, for example, in Europe, in the recent strategic foresight report, they already look into those aspects. Even though you may think that the European countries may have those issues better resolved, right? But they found that the investments they need for the Green Deal are massive, up to 620 billions and even more. And also they are identifying issues like, for example, that the EU consumption footprint has increased 4%, despite that the 13% reduction in the domestic footprint is being also held. So there is not a direct relationship. Or, for example, that there is a massive mismatch in between the skills that are needed and the skills that are at the moment present and produced. So 80% of the EU firms are hampered by the lack of skilled staff. And that will obviously decelerate the transition that they are aiming in the Green Deal. No? And also, social cohesion is threatened by rising inequalities, even in Europe. Or, there are also a lot of pressure on the public budgets because the demographic structure that we are shaping in Europe. So, having said that, we need an alternative way to measure those transitions and the impact of those transitions in welfare and well-being. And the UN is taking a stake on that in the recent Future Pact from the General Assembly resolution in September this year, where there is an action 53 that it will aim to develop a framework of measures of progress on sustainable development to complement and go beyond the gross domestic products. So it's a firm mandate to start this process. There's been papers, there's been a paper that is been compiling what the academia has been produced on indicators. And what you observe basically is that what you have is a huge amount alone. It's giving you what you need, right? And there are up to 30 countries that are starting to produce some sort of combination of indicators to look into this beyond GDP, but yet is a very little number of countries. So what I would like to go with you is that there are frames already suggested, no? For example, this compilation out of what they are being assessing suggests that you will have to have 3 components on such type of indicator frameworks. Well-being, inclusion, and sustainability. We have SDGs for sustainability. We have some indicators emerging for inclusion. And we have some for well-being. But of course, those will have to be decomposed in other aspects like nature, for example, or education, health, and so on. And I don't think we have yet the magic formula, but my understanding so far, and this is why I brought you both here, is that in recent years we have been shaping some emerging standards that may help to sort of distill this, and that we have been working also on better understanding of what information we need, and how this information will have to be dealt with and integrated. So now I will give you 10 minutes, 15 minutes each for telling us what are your impressions on the process, on the perspectives, on the challenges, on the past, on the inconsistencies we face and what we learn. And then we can have a short discussion based on very general questions. So can start.
Is the microphone on? Yes. Thank you for this nice introduction on this topic, which is very much high on the agenda in particular of the. There has been a lot of discussion on what GDP does and GDP does not do. I mean, GDP is a measure of economic performance, and it works for what it is supposed to be designed. But then a lot of people have been trying to use GDP for other purposes, which it's not really designed to do. So there has been a lot of work being done by the statistical community to update the statistical standards to better measure well-being and sustainability. So one thing is the update of the system of national accounts, which will be launched at the Statistical Commission, adopted at the Statistical Commission in March this year. And the balance of payments manual, which try to take into consideration measures of sustainability and well-being. In particular, they include, for example, the measures of depletion of natural resources. So the idea is not to look at GDP as a gross measure, but also try to net it out, not only for depreciation of produced capital, but also for depletion of natural resources. So this was already in the system of environmental economic accounting, but now having it mainstreamed in the system of national accounts, hopefully it will give a push also in the implementation. And also there is an extension of the asset boundary to include renewable energy, and that's actually thanks to the work of the World Bank in the Changing Wealth of Nations, where they started discussing this issue of including the asset base to also include renewable energy. So there is I see a general movement to better measure aspects beyond the economic capital. And I mean, there is a system of environmental economic accounts which was adopted as a statistical standard in 2012, which extends the asset boundary of the SNA, and then we had the ecosystem accounts, which was adopted more recently in 2022, which also includes in the asset boundary the ecosystem assets and the contribution of ecosystem services to our well-being. So I think from a statistical community there is a big push to move beyond the measuring only economic capital, but also measure in particular the natural capital. For human capital and social capital, I think we still are not there in terms of having statistical standards. There are some indicators that pop out, but they are not really integrated within an information system like we have with the SNA and SEEA, which integrates economic and environmental information in a better way. What we are doing in the International Monetary Fund is also a recognition that, in particular, climate. The entry point is really climate. Is what we say it's macro critical. This means that it has an impact on the economic and financial stability of countries. So it's not something that we can consider as an afterthought. So the objective is really trying to mainstream climate into the macroeconomic models that are being used and into the Article 4, the recommendation that is being done at the country level, and trying to also harmonize the data that is being used for making these recommendations. So I think that the fundamental problem is really the implementation. So we have some sort of standards or agreed methodologies, but there is a big data gaps, especially in developing countries. And another challenge, I think, it's also the fact that, for example, ministries of finance and central banks governors, they are not really used in thinking, considering the environment and climate change as part of their way of work. So it is increasingly, there is a lot of demand to have this data, but there is no capacity in really understanding how to use this data in making policies. So.
Yeah, well, thank you, Alexandra. Just a small, let's say, dynamic question here, because we observe, and you also know that the central banks are moving now because, of course, they need to invest in the transition, but they're having trouble on how to incorporate the natural assets and how to also to incorporate the fact that those transitions are threatened themselves for climate change. So do you think that there will be a chance to get central banks and more traditional institutions to get closer to what, for example, from the climate community is being provided in the last 3 decades?
I think there is a movement, and we are observing it because there is a lot of countries that are coming, especially of central banks that are coming to us to request capacity development assistance, in particular linked to these physical and transition risks. So the idea is really trying to understand where the hazards are going to hit, and who is going to be impacted. So what are the loans that are associated with the buildings and assets that will be lost? So who are basically who is going to pay for these losses? This is linked to the insurance sector as well. So there is a lot of attention that now is being given to this type of data. And the other thing is on the transition risks, and in seeing, where to invest to move towards a greener.
Because we will have a lot of Spanish colleagues listening at this conversation. This is exactly the problem we are facing now in Spain with the unprecedented floods. In areas where companies were starting to invest in new business models. And all these areas are at a high risk of being flooded in the coming years. No? The return period of the recent floods in Spain is 1,000 years. So there's no flood like this being seen since the last 1,000 years on record. So, that brings the fact that we need to look at adaptation and mitigation, so transition and impacts, adapting to impacts of climate change as one single thing, even in in developed countries, not only in developing countries. So Kanta, now give us your perspective, coming and working in a region, in a continent which it will face even bigger challenges, but may have also bigger opportunities, I guess.
No, indeed. Thank you very much. So I'm going to maybe make my remarks at two levels, I think, based on what you've already put out. I think first maybe on this whole idea of going beyond GDPs. I think that is obviously important, as we've said, and how to make sure that while keeping intact what the GDP really reflects, how to bring in other dimensions. So here I just wanted to share with you that I think 3 weeks ago, the World Bank launched the 5th edition of what we call the Changing Wealth of Nations. This is really an accumulation of work done over the last 20 years when we started 20 years ago, asking what is the real wealth of countries, right? Beyond what the GDP measure says. And I think what is very exciting about this latest edition is how it has built on a framework that reflects the different types of capital, from human to physical to natural capital, both renewable and non-renewable, and the financial assets. And I think through this work that has been sort of done within this framework, I think there have been certain methodological improvements that have been done over the years, which really have sort of underscored, I think, the criticality of some of the non-market aspects that can really, are not fully reflected in the GDP, right? Particularly as we can imagine in the context of natural capital. So I think where we came out with this particular edition is building on the earlier work, and as was mentioned, a few innovations, right? The first was really, enhancing that asset boundary, right? Bringing in even more dimensions. So while earlier work had looked at some of the impacts from ecosystem services and look at the damage on the shoreline function and mangrove ecosystems, in this round we added the hydropower assets as an important part because of the linkages with various sectors of the economy. And also in the non-renewable added additional minerals to that equation. But that's just one part of it. The second part was, I think, looking at the real wealth per capita against these different types of capital. And I think what was very revealing is how I think whether collectively as a global community or when you dig down between the different income groups of high income, middle income and low income, all of these countries are increasing their physical wealth, obviously with more infrastructure and assets. And human capital is also increasing at different levels, but there is, although the gender parity is still below par. But I think, and so while all those other capitals are increasing, the natural capital was showing a decline. And what is worrisome here, as you mentioned, is that the decline in the natural capital is particularly pronounced in the poorest countries. So for example, in sub-Saharan Africa, it's declined as much as 40%, and South Asia as much as 30%. So even as these countries may be having a GDP growth, it's really at the cost of that natural capital, which is such an important asset to it. So I think that was the second part. So the asset boundary, I think looking at the real capital, real wealth per capita. And the third dimension, perhaps worth mentioning, is that this particular edition of the Changing Wealth of Nations also looked at the issue of substitutability. While previous editions had looked at it in the context of weak sustainability and assumed that the capitals were substitutable, I think we pushed the frontier a little bit to say how it's often not substitutable and that there are some limits to it. And so while this is still work in progress, I think introducing that notion was an important part of the conversation. And so there are other aspects I would encourage everyone to look at it, but one of the important, I think, deliverables of this round was that we produce what you call reproducible packages, where countries can use this global data, and some of them are subscription-based data, to really generate these accounts at the national level. So we have the data and information, I think, up to for about 152 countries. So the idea here is then that countries, besides looking at what the report has done at a global level in terms of the different income economies, also develop their own wealth accounts and have a better understanding of how to really enhance the productivity within their country in a way that is sustainable, that is not undermining, the natural capital or other critical assets. And recognizing also the criticality, as you were mentioning, on the human capital, the social cohesion. I think those aspects will come into that conversation. But I want to shift gear a little bit to sort of using this information, and I think that's really important part of informed policy discourse. And what we've done in the World Bank is that we have this new core diagnostic called the Country Climate Development Report, looking at the interface of climate and development, and recognizing that these two are so integrally linked. And what we do in this report essentially is use a scenario-based approach of sort of high levels of warming, and then the Paris Agreement and others, and NDC targets of the country, to visualize scenarios of how development could play out and where adaptation and mitigation strategies can make a difference. But in analyzing this, we also look and bring into the macro models some of the impact analysis. So it's very interesting you talk about the floods in Spain. So one, we look at different impact channels. We look at heat stress and impact on labor productivity, but we also look at floods and how those floods could undermine the contribution to of course, the direct impact on the people, but also the multiplier impact on the economy. And I think this is really then translating into adaptation, recognizing the criticality of natural capital, of forest conservation in the watersheds and soil erosion that has to be controlled. And this recognition of how it really feeds into the macro model is quite important. So one of the overarching findings of our CCDR reports taken collectively, I think globally, but certainly I know the figures for sub-Saharan Africa, is that by 2050, if we didn't address the issues, GDP in these countries, together with these impact channels that we looked at in the macro, could be affected as much as 2 to 19% in different countries. And that is really quite significant when you think about the context in the sub-Saharan African context. And when you look at the high end of the countries that could reach impacts of 18, 19%, I think is Benin and others, it really begins to see what is it that we need to do. And when we analyzed it, I think clearly the sort of importance of adaptation measures is very high. So whether it is better environmental management, better social cohesion, looking at the vulnerability analysis. So I just want to say this because I think this is where the data and analysis on the accounting feeds into the impact analysis and the impacts on the macroeconomy. And the second overarching message from our CCDRs in the African context is how critical adaptation is, and adaptation in the near term. And that there is a higher cost to it, but obviously the returns in the longer term are better off. So I just wanted to make the link between what we will be talking about GDP and it sounds so abstract to what it really means to people on the ground. And I don't want to forget the transitions to the side on the mitigation side, which are equally important because really energy security is so critical. So when you look at the context in sub-Saharan Africa, where half the people do not have access to even energy today, that whole access to energy is part of the resilience that can be built. And it always has a direct impact also on the gender side of equation. But we can come back to this in the discussion, but I just wanted to put into perspective what I think this conversation is so important, because it goes really from the abstract and the macro to really make a difference in terms of how we better design policy and action on the ground.
Yeah, thank you. I think that that's a very interesting point, because when in Dubai we were talking about international cooperation to accelerate the climate action, that was one of the big questions. I mean, how you orchestrate the international cooperation in order to address issues like this. I mean, climate change is threatening flows of materials, for example, that are critical for transitions even in developed countries. But there is no architecture for giving directions and information to the individual countries on what is the best chances they have to fit into a bigger, more coordinated global puzzle. So maybe it's not possible to agree on sitting together to coordinate and to orchestrate, but providing the right information to the countries, to themselves, to locate themselves in this big global, let's say, accelerator, it will help a lot, rather than forcing people to sit, no? And then there is the other point, which is the private sector. I mean, it's the private sector who is doing at least a large amount of the investments, but they don't have either guidance on where to invest. So how do you think the private sector may play a role also in this landscape?
I think the private sector is critical. I think, just in the context even of what countries are putting out in terms of their NDC ambition, you can see that the financing gap is very significant. And in fact, a lot of these quantums of the financing gap were really also reassessed through the country climate development reports. And there is a huge gap. And clearly that funding cannot be met by the public sector alone. So the private sector is key. But I think with the case of the private sector, I think it's always about really meeting them where their best comparative advantage is, but at the same time, also working with them in areas that they need to innovate by trying to reduce the level of risks. And I think that is becoming really important. So I think in the traditional sort of agro-industrial sectors, I think the private sector is very comfortable because they sort of, are familiar with the agro-industries and the agro-enterprises. But I think where the new opportunities come in terms of the carbon markets, I think it's really, I was just coming out of a session at the World Bank stand looking at how the multilateral investment guarantee agency is trying to come in now to provide a risk platform to take care of the risks, the sovereign risk when private sector will come into this context of the carbon markets. So I think this is really important, especially to reach scale. So I think that how we think about the innovations, the opportunities, but really tailor make it somehow to also benefit, as we were saying, the communities and their livelihood options.
Yeah, and I think, Alexandra, IMF is trying to work also in that direction to provide information which will be critical not only for the governments but also for private sector.
Yeah, I mean, one initiative that the IMF is doing in trying to organize this space on in terms of information is the G20 Data Gaps Initiative, where there is the central banks governors and the ministers of finance. They basically agreed that there are serious data gaps on the climate space. And so they came up with a series of 7 recommendations to that all countries, basically all the G20 countries, are encouraged to report on. And this, I mean, in addition to the kind of more standard data sets like on emissions and carbon footprint, energy accounts, but also looking at, for example, the footprints of foreign direct investments, but climate finance, so green bonds, green securities, and this is some of these indicators are quite new, so there is also no methodology. The other one, which I think it's also very relevant, is physical and transition risks. So how do we define a set of indicators that the G20 countries will report on, and how we can also leverage global data sets and Earth observation data to basically try to develop initial estimates. And this is and the other 2 indicators which I think are also very relevant is defining climate related expenditures and subsidies. And there is no methodology associated with this. So we are struggling and trying to integrate it in the statistical standards and testing it in a number of countries. And what we are doing is also rolling this type of program, not only in the G20 countries, but also in the developing countries. And I think this physical and transition risks is really the area where we find there is most demand. And also there are most opportunities because we could probably use global data sets and global models to at least to look at the hazards and exposures. Then when it comes to vulnerability, it becomes very much a very localized type of data that is needed. And it's also data which is very confidential. If we want to look at, for example, the loans and the insurance, this type of data of the particular buildings and assets in a particular location, this is only basically the central banks will have access to it, and will we cannot even have access to look at these data sets. But at least if we start to develop some sort of methodologies and we start to use global data sets as initial estimates and showing what can be done with this data, it provides some sort of an incentives then for countries to develop this information.
That's very interesting because if you remember in June in the 8th Big Data Conference in Bilbao, I think it was the first time that I saw the insurance sector, the central banks, IMF, and the scientific community together in a session. And to me, it was obvious that they don't talk each other very often, no. So how you see this challenge to be in the future overcome? I mean, in this COP we are seeing plenty of new platforms of data, plenty of new willingness to integrate different types of models. But again, it is all fragmented. So what we can do in order to avoid that and make sure that at least everyone is using the same data and the same methodologies or comparable methodologies.
Yeah, I think you touched on two big points. One is the issue of data being dispersed in different institutions at the country level, and often they don't talk to each other. So we see that one of our role when we give technical assistance is really bringing everybody on the table and understand that the data which is already available that can be used and integrated to develop something that it could be useful for policy and decision making. And the other point is on the global data sets, that there are a lot of, I would say almost competition in different data sets, because we all start from the same. I mean, we all use IPCC data sets, but then each organization gives it some sort of, makes its own assumption to it, and then we end up with different data, which creates a problem also of credibility, I think. I think it's almost a disservice to the entire community having different data sets. So I think that it would be useful to have some sort of a mechanism that actually looks at maybe a minimum set of global data sets that can be standardized, and then we can all use the same data sets for as an input into the models. I mean, we should start small, but have some data sets like a temperature and heat. Everyone uses these data sets, and then identifying like some indicators on, I don't know, number of days above 35 degrees, or some sort of simple indicators that where we can all agree on and have the same data. One other thing also that I discovered when looking at these different methodologies is, for example, what we define climate finance is different from what the UNFCCC defines climate finance. And so having two international agencies coming up with different numbers from and using the terminology which is not consistent can create a lot of confusion, and I think at the end it undermines the credibility, because basically saying, oh, IMF says this, UNFCCC says something else, and then you say, okay, then forget it, we're not going to do anything.
Which brings us to the importance of common ontologies and basing this integration into data which has common definitions and also is interoperable in a way, because otherwise you introduce uncertainty by just introducing different definitions. It was very interesting that yesterday was a discussion here where it was a private company, and they started to talk about OPEX and CAPEX and how they distinguish the new investments in CAPEX or not, and the difficulties they have to fit this with the new taxonomies. So also the private sector seems to have problems with that, but also it's an opportunity to play on their own side, let's say. So, Kanta, in Africa, of course, they will have problems on gathering this information, and therefore the tendency is to rely more on global data sets, right? Which in essence, it may be positive because it's more harmonized. But also propose challenges, because as you said, Alessandra, for example, for the heat waves, the thresholds depend very much on the actual vulnerability, for example, of the communities. You may have the same temperature, but if the community is more vulnerable, the threshold has to be lower. So how you see that is evolving in Africa in the light of the scarce data, but the possibilities to use global data sets?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think the way that we've had to tackle it is, I think, take it step by step, right? If we wait for perfect data at the national level, disaggregated, and for the key parameters, we might be waiting forever, right? So let me give you an example. I do a lot of work in the Congo Basin countries, which, as we know, are high forest, low deforestation countries, and currently are the only net carbon sink globally. Even the Amazon and the Southeast Asian forests are not net carbon sinks. And in these countries, I mean, the coverage of forests goes from anywhere from 70 to 80, 85%. But yet, at the same time, they do not have forest accounts. They know that the contribution of forests to the GDP, and it's often not that large because it's only capturing the market value from timber, but not all of the other ecosystem services. So what we've done in the last year is under Congo Basin Advisory work, we've been developing the forest accounts as part of the national capital accounts for the 6 Congo Basin countries. And this includes DRC, Republic of Congo, Gabon, Cameroon, Equatorial Guinea, and Central African Republic. So the good news is that I think we've almost completed developing the forest accounts for each of these countries. And so it's for the very first time that they actually have forest accounts, which cover a few different things. For the different types of forest, from lowland to submontane to montane, we've looked at what is the extent of the forest from the year 2000, 2010 to 2020. And we also look at the condition through various variables, including connectivity, canopy cover, the naturalness index, and another factor that I can't remember right now, but four indices. And then we look at what are the sort of values coming out of this forest, from timber to the non-timber forest products in terms of fuel wood, in terms of poles, in terms of the bushmeat, as well as looking at the soil erosion function. And lastly, we looked at the carbon sink value of it. And we then finally have converted them into monetary values. Now, we use global data sets, to come back to your point. So we use the GLAD data, the Global Forest Watch, and the TMF, and had to triangulate it both for the duration that we're trying to cover in terms of the sequencing, but also the granularity of data. But I think it provides us a good baseline of information, which for the governments is for the first time that they have these forest accounts. And as we look at not just the physical accounts, but the monetary accounts, it's really revealing to us how important their assets are, not just at the national level, but at the global level, in terms of the carbon sink, especially because they also have peatlands, which are have so much more biomass and soil organic matter. So I think the point here is how do we then translate it into decision-making processes that inform not just the national but the global economy. I'm going to take it. So I believe that this process of using global data sets sometimes has to be there to facilitate the kind of information. Now we can set up protocols over time to collect and validate additional data. Of course, we've used satellite data to also triangulate it back. But I think it's the way to go with technology. And the most important is building the capacity of the countries. So through this process, we had dedicated capacity building sessions for each module so that the statistics agencies, the environment agencies, planning, finance, and others have been part of that process.
Yeah, that's very interesting because also I understand that in Africa there has been also some efforts by the World Bank to address the water. So yeah, the point that I wanted to make is that in Africa there is also the World Bank addressing the water because the tropical forests are key for the water for the global water cycle, not only for the regional and country water cycles. So and that may bring me to this dispersion of efforts, no? Because the Congo Basin countries have been doing lots of efforts for REDD+. So they have country-specific information of high quality on carbon stocks, basically. So, and this is not connected, probably. Well, I'm glad that you say that because in the past it was not. So you are making bridges between these. The country efforts, World Bank is very much engaged in supporting those countries as well for RED Plus.
Indeed, I think that several of the countries were part of the FCPF. So the Democratic Republic of Congo, as well as Cameroon. They had their readiness. So whereas Cameroon didn't go beyond the readiness, in DRC and in Republic of Congo, they are at the emission reduction phase where they will get the credit payment. But many of the countries have also developed the RED Plus strategy. So for example, in Cameroon, they have developed a RED Plus strategy, identified between 45 to 50 priorities that we are actually also working with them together with other partners to really get the sort of monetization to the carbon credits and carbon. But it's a process, right? Because there are many building blocks to getting carbon credits.
Yeah, I guess what is clear is that the data is critical. We have lots of data, but we are not using them in the best way we could. So we need to have a discussion about how data is going to be informing the development of these new potential indicators for going beyond GDP. And this has to be done collectively by all communities sitting together. As a final question, just to inform the potential scientists that may be listening to us, what do you think are being the biggest simplifications and misuse of GDP in terms of some of the work that the economists have been doing in the last 2 decades that will be solved by moving beyond GDP?
Yeah, I can go first. I think the scientists are very important. I think as we begin to look at, we found that, for example, when you're trying to understand the value of an ecosystem service and the dynamic of what that really is, I mean, a lot of it really comes from scientific data or applied sciences to understand the function of that ecosystem service that is provided. The easiest to understand is the soil erosion function and how that can relate to when you reduce the forest cover or coverage in an ecosystem, it can increase the soil erosion value, and then compound that with, as you had mentioned earlier, the return period of flooding now, of the precipitation patterns and the changes, also needs to be factored into the scientific way to understand the totality of impact. And, so I think the sort of scientific understanding of the linkages and the metrics that they provide is very critical for then converting that into the physical damage and then bringing in the monetary value, right? And the pricing is always an important part too, especially when the market doesn't have a price. How do you determine the price, not just for today, but even for the future, and what kind of discount rates? So I think it's really bringing the sort of physical scientists, to the geographers, to the economists together to really make that cohesive understanding that can really inform not just the accounting process and the GDP process, but really interventions on the ground.
So, Alexandra, from your background and
Yeah, on having my environmental and economic accounts hat, I think that the biggest misuse of GDP is considering it as a measure of welfare. And so having a GDP growth is kind of the aim, the ultimate aim that we are looking at, but that's not actually even, especially in this day and age, correlated to well-being or to what's going on with the natural capital. I mean, if we even look at the situation in Valencia, the GDP will probably go up because there will be a lot of money spent to reconstruct, to rebuild, and so on. But actually there are fundamental losses that come out from that. So, and the same thing what Kanta was saying, I mean, all the ecosystem services are not included in GDP. So if you destroy a forest and you use the timber, let's say, to build furniture, your GDP goes up, but you are not taking into account that you are actually lost not only the future timber, but also the ecosystem services associated with this. And I think that this has to be more communicated, because I think that a lot of people do not really understand what GDP is about. It's just a measure of economic performance, economic production, but not beyond that. So, and I think that, what Kenta was saying, bringing economists and scientists and ecologists on the same table, it's a way forward. But that's not an easy, and it's not an easy discussion, because each community has its own way of thinking, its own terminology, and also its own focus, because sometimes it's not easy to talk to scientists. They sometimes get very much into the little details and don't really see the bigger picture. So there is always a need for having some sort of a middle person, I would say, that kind of tries to translate this discussion between the economist and the scientist. And I know, because this is a little bit the role that I have been playing in trying to build on the expertise that the scientists have, especially on the measurement side, but how we can actually develop statistical measures that are also integrated with economic measure. And so I think that the data gap is a challenge, but what is more a challenge is really the organization of this data and the presentation of this data in a way that is digestible to the users, because otherwise we end up speaking with each other, but without bringing it to the use of the decision makers.
I think you made the two big points here. Yes, the data access, the producing the right data that is needed for what you want to do, but also is a challenge in between the communities. And I'm saying that by experience, because my institute has all the communities together, and even in the same building it's difficult to sit them and have a conversation. And I was quite shocked, for example, because I am an ecologist, but I was quite shocked when I started to talk more with economists, and when I figured out the assumptions that were made about nature, and I say, what? So indeed, in BC3, we are starting to have these more cross-cutting conversations between communities, but it's a huge effort, and you need middle ground people that has an overview, a sense of direction, and also you need some sort of architectures that will help to do this integration, which in our case, and you know, Alexandra, one of the architectures we want to use for that is ARIES, which is Artificial Intelligence for Sustainability. And indeed, it's starting to work. So we are starting to integrate very different types of models, but with assumptions which are transparent and understood by the different communities. And the fact that ARIES is based on common ontologies is helping to alleviate these different perceptions and definitions of the same concepts. So I think that this could be the future, but obviously we need to address both.
And ARIES is based on the statistical standards.
And ARIES is based on the base for operating the statistical standards of the UN at the moment, and we hope that this will be a first step of trying to bring these communities together, which I think is what we need now. We need this to create spaces for having the same discussion we're having here. Maybe we need a pure economist as well, which didn't come this time, but let's have it the next time. So any final message you want to give to the audience?
I think, we are on a good road. I think there's a greater recognition that we really need to look at wealth in a holistic way, in a sustainable way, recognize the limits of substitutability. And now I think when we are beginning to get to a lot of the planetary boundaries, I think this is really driving home. So I think we're in a good place to begin to bring the best, as you said, of the cross collaboration. But really, as was also mentioned, to present it in a way that can be digested and inform policy level decisions and action on the ground in a meaningful way. So I think I'm very hopeful that I think with sort of continued efforts, really bringing this wealth accounting, natural capital accounting into the GDPs is really the way to go. And I think we're in a good place, and hopefully we can ramp up and accelerate those efforts in whatever way we can, because it's an urgent thing. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think similar to what Kenta is saying, I think we are on the right track because we are seeing signals that there is interest of this information on environment and climate change data, and that they are being mainstreamed in economic policies and in the macroeconomic models. And so I think we are at the initial stages, so we still need more work, but I think that things are moving in the right direction, and I think we'll be moving quite quickly. Unfortunately, this is because in response of what we are seeing now of all the bad news, and I mean, I feel we are more in a reactive. Have been until now much more in a reactive mode. Basically, there are these natural disasters, but now we are seeing that these are becoming more and more frequent. So we have to kind of switch gear and become more proactive and take measures before we are then faced with the disasters.
Well, my message is that I feel reconforted that I am in the right place. So it was a good decision to go to a center which tries to bring all these things together and collaborate with institutions like yours. Thank you very much with this beautiful gender panel and for the very, very interesting discussions. And thank you for your time and your efforts to be here. I know you arrived yesterday, you arrived this morning, so thanks a lot to both of you. And hopefully we can continue this discussion in future COPs as well.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much.
Thank
indeed.
you. Thank you.